In the last year, there have been a proliferation of bills and more public moments of political bullies, read grown-ass adults, targeting children. And schools, there have been more than 525 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced across every state in our country except one.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rashaun Kemp, and I am the Senior Director at the National Charter Collaborative. We are an organization that supports single site leaders of color across the country that are leading our single site charter schools. And I have been super excited to have this conversation. We at NCC wanted to engage the amazing Dr. David Johns about safe, supportive, and inclusive schools. And for those of you that don't know, Dr. David Johns is a leader in civil rights and empowerment of Black, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer plus, and same gender loving people, including people living with AIDS and HIV. He formerly was a leader within the Obama White House and is currently the executive director of the National Black Justice Coalition. So, Dr. Johns, thank you so much for having this conversation with us. I'm super excited. As I've shared, we know a lot of the same people, so this is a long time coming. So let's just start out with this. So many of our schools pride themselves on creating safe and culturally affirming schools for their communities. But developing those kind of spaces with the many intersecting identities of the community is difficult. So just from your opinion and experience, what is a good place to start for school leaders of color as they work to develop schools and school cultures that are accepting to all?
Yeah. First, let me say thank you to you, Rashaun, for hosting this, to my friend and leader of the collaborative, Naomi, for facilitating the invitation, and to all of the members. If people hear me say nothing else over the course of this conversation, I hope they hear my heart when I say thank you for doing God's work, that of teaching our babies. So I had a visceral reaction to the framing of the question, and I want to push against it. I fundamentally reject the idea that creating safe and inclusive classroom environments is difficult. I think the exact opposite is true. And that's not just my experience as an educator, researcher who I'm a sociologist. I chose sociology, one, because I'm a student of Asa Hilliard, who said, I never met a child in particular, a Black child, who is not a genius. There's no secret to how we support them. We acknowledge them as human first. And thereafter, we support them with love, which to me is the blueprint for all of this, not just the work of creating classroom environments and school communities and cultures within and around them that see people for who they are, that support students and educators and other adults in figuring out and making sense of the world around them that is continuing to evolve, grappling with language and how it is evolving, especially with regard to how students are coming to name their development within already socially constructed boxes that we refer to in policy spaces, using terms like sexual orientation, gender identity expression, or sexual minority status, or LGBTQIA+. This is a really long way of saying that what I know based on my research, my experience as an educator and as a policymaker, is that the exact opposite is true. That creating environments that see students for who they are, allow people to explore, make sense of how they are identifying at different moments in time, and that emphasize values on community and love and support, especially during the difficult process of learning, right? The Latin root of the word education is educare. It means to draw out. This is supposed to be difficult by design. So creating spaces where people feel empowered to take risks and dare to name themselves in ways that don't make sense to others, I would argue is easier for educators who understand that teaching is, one, political, and two, in this moment, requires being mindful of how socially constructed identities affect equity as it exists in classroom spaces and communities. And finally, I would argue, am arguing in this moment, that the work of policing what people can and can't say, e.g., gay, banning books uh, because they make people feel, creating laws that make it a criminal offense for teachers to invite in or talk about the diversity that has always existed is much more difficult, especially with regard to the work required of educators in not only navigating those rules and policies and environments, but then in also teaching kids how to make sense of the world that is going to exist in spite of all of these barriers to critical thinking and or engagement. So this is a really long way of saying I reject the premise of your question. And I think that any educator who understands the importance of teaching, especially in public schools now, should understand much of what I'm attempting to intimate.
Yeah, I love that. And I appreciate that. So you went there. So I just want to skip some of my questions and go to this. So, as another LGBT Black man, one thing that has stood out to me from following you and seeing some of your writings is the idea and notion of dispelling for people in general, but I think it's important for schools that are trying to create these environments to be mindful of this for their educators, for students, for their families, for parents that are within the community. Speak to us about your notion of dispelling the idea of coming out versus inviting in. Talk to us about that.
That's easy given the framing because I wrote down a note to thank you for inviting me and us in this space in. I No one is entitled to intimate information about who you are and how you move through the world, especially because that bit of information, the disclosure that you identify as a member of a sexual minority community to no fault of your own, simply because of how those categories have been constructed within the white supremacist construct. You don't owe that to anybody, and I appreciated you sharing it with me and inviting me in. So the root of this is that I hate the phrase, and I know educators shouldn't hate things. I hate the phrase coming out. I would be okay with it if everybody had to do it, but that's really not how it works in practice. And I'm all about, as a student of Black freedom strugglers, for me, this is all about power. And often there's this expectation of people coming out that looks like cisgender people. And let's stop here because I don't want to make assumptions. Gender is assigned at birth by a doctor who sometimes before birth makes an educated guess at what they think the sex of a child is going to be. Sex is often conflated with gender, such that when a doctor assumes that a child's sex is going to be that of a girl, people start to think in pink and paint worlds that are shaped by what we expect of girls and or women, without regard for how often those expectations are tethered to um, relationships to men, and relationships or marriages that are sanctioned by a state. I'll come back to that with regard to language later. But the point here is that doctors assign gender, and if you identify with the gender that a doctor assigned to you, you are cis, CIS. It is not a slur. It is a designation that allows us to talk in with precision. And if that is not the case for you, if your gender identity is inconsistent with the assignment that a doctor makes, you're trans. There's much more to how these experiences show up in the lives of people, especially Black trans folk. But that's what the terms mean. Semicolon. Um, what point was I about to make? Oh, inviting in. So simply what happens is that cisgender people often stand with their arms folded, expecting for us queer people to disclose when we realize we were weird, when the gag is we have superpowers. And a part of this is that each of us, while not everybody has a superpower that comes with being queer, and I'm going to introduce another term in a second, um, every one of us who lives in capitalist North America has a stigma that has been socially constructed. There's something that we live with to no fault of our own, again, that society tells us we should feel shame around. With my dissertation, which studied the experiences of Black LGBTQIA plus public, middle, and high school students, one of the most surprising things was them naming colorism and how toxic that is for them. So it could be skin color, it could be family's financial history, our mental health. Each of us have something with us, as we used to say, but because of how power works and religious trauma, sexual deviation is ranked higher. So people feel like they have this moral superiority with regard to people who are members of our community. So I don't believe in any of that. I don't believe that people are entitled to knowledge about me, especially when it makes me more vulnerable. But I do believe if you demonstrate an interest, a willingness to do work to increase your competence, to learn about pronouns, to watch things like this, to follow folks who do the labor of teaching out loud every day, um, and you demonstrate compassion, I might invite you in. I might share something with you that, again, you're not entitled to, but could be important for how you understand or make sense of me and how I move through the world. So that's inviting in. We celebrate inviting in on James Baldwin's birthday, and offer it as a counterpoint to coming out. I also, I studied, I like language. Clearly, I studied English as an undergraduate student at Columbia, where I did 3 tours of duty. That's why I earned this PhD. It also vexes me that people think about coming out as a singular experience, like you come out and then that's it. Like most of us are challenged with negotiating and navigating the question of whether or not we invite in multiple times a day. And for Black, Native, Indigenous, um, queer folks, especially femme identified, trans, and non binary folks, that can also invite not only transphobia, but other forms of violence and danger. A footnote here is we're having this conversation on a day where I posted to my Instagram accounts about a Black cis woman who was murdered because of transphobia. And I'm going to look it up because I want to make sure that I say her full name correctly. But Michelle Dion Peacock is a 59-year-old Black cis woman who was murdered by a 67-year-old man who said that she was a man acting like a woman. So I want to make the point that transphobia affects more than just trans people, and all of us should be more conscious of how power works, including through important symbolic rituals like coming out. I said I was going to introduce another term. I don't use gay. Words matter. Again, when I say gay, people think white gay men. They think power. They think winning political movement agenda. And most of the things, all of those things are important, but they're not important to me. When I think about the realities of Black LGBTQIA plus folks who are disproportionately marginalized and invisibilized because of the ways in which race and assumptions about race supersede acknowledging the importance of intersectionality. So I use the term same gender loving, which was created by a Black man, Cleo Manago, that centers my understanding unapologetically that I am Black, and would not trade it on any day. And also holds space for the fact that I am same gender loving. The term gets away from people thinking about sex and deviance in that regard, and HIV and positionality. And it centers what I often appreciated was the answer in debates between James Baldwin and Nikki Giovanni when discussing out loud solutions to seemingly intractable problems that our people face. So that's inviting in and same gender loving.
Wow, all of this is so powerful. And, to be honest, our conversation has shifted a little bit because so much of this I can relate to. And I know that there are so many other educators within our schools that experience this, the challenge of being faced with having to come out, like sometimes, like you said, multiple times in a day, or folks that don't identify the way that we do, feeling like they have the right to expect that we are to come out, how they expect us to come out. And so I want to talk about the current political environment that we're in. We have the Supreme Court decision that pretty much gave it a right to folks within this country to refuse to provide services to people within the LGBTQ plus community. And you have things that are happening with, trans rights and, don't say gay. Speak to kind of where we are in society today. And I guess we can cross that with the importance of education, since we are speaking to educators, and the importance of them creating environments that push back and welcome in students versus, kind of exacerbating what is happening in politics today. Just talk to us a little bit about that.
That was a lot. Um,
A lot. I know.
so I want to name that. I heard a couple of things. One is a question of where are we? We are exactly where we should be. I'm trying to think of the best order in which to do this. We are exactly where we should be. And as evidence of that, I pulled this book by Bell Hooks, Our Ancestor, lowercase b, lowercase h, because she wanted you to focus on the work. And in teaching critical thinking, practical wisdom, Bell makes a number of important observations. One of them is that children's passion for thinking often ends when they encounter a world that seeks to educate them for conformity and obedience only. Most children are taught early on that thinking is dangerous. Mm. Whether in homes with parents who teach via a model of discipline and punish that it is better to choose obedience over self-awareness and self-determination, or in schools where independent thinking is not acceptable behavior, most children in our nation learn to suppress the memory of thinking as a passionate, pleasurable activity. Hold that for a second. Bell also makes the connection to why, again, I'm a sociologist and study schools, because Bell underscores my argument that teaching is political. And anyone who has questions about that should contemplate them outside of the profession. So Bell says that there is little public discourse among students today about the nature of democracy. Nowadays, most students simply assume that living in a democratic society is their birthright. They do not believe that they must work to maintain democracy. They do not know. Later, she then talks about John Dewey and says they do not read John Dewey. Let me back up and read the whole thing. I was going to skip to the end, but I think it makes sense in this context. Nowadays, most students simply assume that living in a democratic society is their birthright. They do not believe that they must work to maintain democracy. They may not even associate democracy with the ideal of equality. In their minds, the enemies of democracy are always and only some foreign other waiting to attack and destroy their democratic life. They do not read the American thinkers, past and present, who teach us the meaning of democracy. They do not read John Dewey. They do not know his powerful declaration that, quote, democracy has to be born anew in each generation, and education is its midwife, end quote. So where we are is in the middle of a continued assault on democracy led by white, right-wing, white supremacists funded by an extremely powerful group of primarily evangelical thinking and leading people, including Betsy DeVos, the former Secretary of Education, folks who are attempting to remake our social order society in their very narrow, very white image. This is the same mission that we see being acted upon successfully in this moment by the Supreme Court and the Federalists who are interpreting, who are reinterpreting and reimagining, to be precise, judicial case law heretofore that included what should have been settled arguments about how we all get closer to freedom, including through education as democracy's midwife. The manifestation of this current moment in this movement is that in the last year, there have been a proliferation of bills and more public moments of political bullies, read grown ass adults targeting children. And schools, there have been more than 525 anti LGBTQ bills introduced across every state in our country except one. The vast majority of those bills target trans students, attempting to restrict their ability to use bathrooms of their choosing. I always laugh when I think about this because as an educator, as long as they weren't peeing on my classroom floor, I didn't really care where they went to the bathroom. And it's cheaper to create gender neutral spaces, but we often don't question the contracts that school boards sign off on that create separate gender reinforcing binary stalls. Uh, they try and do that. They try and restrict the ability for children who often are not identifying in solidarity with these very heavy political categories. And I say this acknowledging, and this frustrates the shit out of me. I know grown ass adults who engage in queer, intimate, romantic, sexual relationships who will never identify as queer. Often, when it comes to our babies and students in schools, it's kids who are not performing gender in ways that we expect them to, who get labeled as queer, who end up being unsupported and questioning what it even might be at some point to show up as a member of the community, but often don't get the ability to, and that's borne out in the suicide rates of our youth, which I'll come back to at another point. So these bills are attempting to restrict the ability for children to participate in extracurricular programs and activities in sports, which we know, based on lots of investments at every level, are important for the development of children and communities and their understanding of skills that we expect for them to have and demonstrate in our global 21st century workforce, and are important for development at that point in a person's life. And then there are more aggressive bills that are restricting access to life saving, life affirming care and criminalizing the provision of it by others. There have been more than 125 anti Black, anti CRT, stop woke bills introduced across states and municipalities throughout the country. There are a couple of states in the South, led by Tennessee, that are banning drag performances, all while people continue to suffer um, as a result of the novel coronavirus and its exacerbation of things already connected to and tainted by white supremacy, gaps in people having access to basic services that are being further ruptured by technological um, innovations that continue to benefit privileged white people and those who enable white supremacy. Um, and you see um, actors again operating to hoard power, taking over school boards under the guise of being moms for liberty when many of them aren't mothers. If they are, they don't have kids in the district, not attending public schools. And like Betsy DeVos, they otherwise demonstrate a wanton disregard for um, public democratic institutions, schools, chief among them. Acknowledging that teaching is political, we should not be surprised that we're here. And I wish that more of us educators, those who do God's work, to quote Freeman Rabowski, uh, would be more willing to challenge the policies and practices that enable white supremacy to structure curriculum and culture and classroom while we continue to espouse equity as the goalpost and or guiding light. Um, I paused initially when thinking about framing my response to this question because I was also thinking about a colleague, Nadine Smith, who runs Florida Equality. She is responsible for naming the horrible legislation that the governor of Florida, whose name I will not say, introduced, but is now called Don't Say Gay. Nadine talks about where we are in this moment as being at the very tail part of a slingshot being pulled. And she says that wanting us those who are students of history, who believe in our very fragile and young democracy, and who know that not only did everything originate in Africa, but the legacy of African people throughout the diaspora and the world is one of persistence in spite of, innovating because of, that we will ultimately get free because when the slingshot is released, because at some point it's going to either break because they pull it too hard or they try too much, or it will be released simply because of how physics works and the sustained effort of folks like Bayard Rustin, the architect of the modern March on Washington, or Marshall P. Johnson, who has led us to having a Pride anything, including a Pride Month in June because of her role in the rebellion at Stonewall, which happened because there were policies that said it was legal to deny queer people liquor. There were policies that said women couldn't wear pants. Because there were people in positions of power, some of them themselves homosexuals, to use a term at the time, who were acting in these self-loathing ways because they believed that privilege would save them, which we know has been proven over time to not be true. And so I offer this analogy of the slingshot as a reminder that at some point we will be released from this current hold that this very small, very powerful minority has over our geopolitical environment, to say the least. And when that happens, we will not only be further, we will be further beyond where we were before these current attacks were waged. Um, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it did. And, this is really moving to me. A big shout out to Nadine Smith. I've never met her, but having just been down in Florida and you giving that analogy of a slingshot, I feel that tension, like, and it's weighty, like just feeling the tension of where we are. And um, so I just wanted to, shout her out for that, because that analogy, it really is, a strong one. So you spoke to a couple of, like, I feel like really tactical things that like educators can take from this conversation. One being the fact that democracy is something that happens like every day. And we have the ability as educators to really educate kids and children in our classrooms to protect that, to learn it, to grow it, to expand on it, to be thinkers. And so we have that ability. In addition, you talk about having gender neutral bathrooms. And I think a lot of people think when they hear that, like, oh, I have to go and do something that's going to cost us tens and thousands of dollars. And then just even beyond the thinking that way, they don't do anything. So what are some like tactical things from your experience, from your opinion, that like educators can do? The school year is getting ready to start. I'm in Atlanta, so it's getting ready to start here in a couple of weeks, but in other parts of the country here in a couple of months. Like, what are some things, if you were an educator or you were talking to educators, you would want them to take away? These are things you can do starting in August, starting in September, that are going to create more inclusive environments for students, regardless of, whether it's about race, whether it's about sexual identity. What are some things that you think that you would want educators to hear?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I got three. One is when I worked for still my president, Barack Hussein Obama, his fabulous wife, Michelle Obama Robinson Obama, Sasha Malia, the dog, Sunny Bow, and Grandma Robinson, leading White House initiative on educational excellence for African Americans. We produced a summit series in partnership with Ebony Magazine, Johnson Publishing Company, and some 30 colleges and universities around the country. These for me were anchors in one of my primary objectives, which was to disrupt the habit that adults have of one, having conversations about students, and then solving problems that they identify for students without engaging them in the conversation or solution identification and solving process. And so we made a rule that you could not talk about students, in particular Black students, in the White House or at the Department of Ed without them being present. And then the summit became a very practical way of saying that when we are developing agendas, policy agendas, problem solving agendas, whatever you want to call them, students should be centered in that process. And so we asked students after, we created these conditions where we would teach them about or introduce and then sharpen skills around policy identification and development, advocacy, the importance of student voice, all things that students know, that if you find the right language, you can make these critical connections. And for folks that are looking for language, with Black youth in particular, I'd point you to Chris Emden, who does a lot around hip hop as a language, including one that helps us teach kids science. So we produced these summits, and one thing that was unchanging, aside from the fact that one rule is that the only experts who got to speak were students as young as kindergarten, the age of the experts that I taught, is that we asked them, what do you need in order to thrive? We didn't define thriving. We didn't provide context. We didn't do Pictionary to intimate it. We just asked them, what do you need in order to thrive? And then we use their answer to drive the discussion going forward. I won't bury the lead and I'll offer up. I used to do it like when I was still working in that space. Like, what do you think the answer is? The answer that was most frequently offered was love. And then no surprise, because whatever someone was probably imagining as soon as I said that, like, was beneath that is love, right? The time, effort, labor, energy required to do that which you know a student needs. And so I offer not only that question, but that practice as a way to ask them what they need. Very much related to that, I would encourage people to reimagine safety. A part of my dissertation, again, which was not again, my dissertation was born out of a number of conditions. One, I spent nearly a decade on Capitol Hill, often as the only Black man, often without there ever being a discussion about sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. And when people advocated for and on behalf of Black students, there was an assumption that they were all cisgendered and heterosexual, which has never been true. Conversely, whenever organizations like HRC or GLSEN or Trevor advocated for queer kids, there was an assumption and symbolic references that reinforced this idea that those kids were all white and or Asian, which is a whole other conversation about proximity to whiteness earned through legal battle, e.g. the twin affirmative actions rendered or decisions rendered by the Supreme Court. But the point here is that what came up in this dissertation that was really designed to name that, as Sambufu Some says in his book, The Spirit of Intimacy, while the words in Africa, the words lesbian and gay didn't exist, the word gatekeeper did. Gatekeeper is our version of two-spirited, which I often say to like bigots in our community who profess to want Black people to get free, but then like don't believe that like we are beautifully, perfectly designed by a God who makes no mistakes, that like you hold space for Native and Indigenous folks that have two-spirited people. If everything began in Africa, the shit just didn't skip us. Yeah. Right. But the point here is that often in school spaces, we approach safety from a white supremacist paradigm that results in the victim being isolated, often further restricted from access to the people and programming, for lack of a more precise term, that they need in order to thrive, especially after being victimized, while the bully gets to draw power from being a bully without remediation or repair or restorative justice for the things that led to them acting out in that way. And so safety becomes like a checklist of activities around like, you know, isolation in a room or in a group or starting a GSA. Some things that are important, but things that never get at the root cause of why somebody felt empowered enough to want to affect somebody's life in a negative way, by harming them, by terrorizing them, by traumatizing them, by pushing them closer to suicide. This is the second time Sal just mentioned it. I had a footnote earlier, which is that like some of this shouldn't even be about the terms or things that like people don't understand or like will never condone. Newsflash, we're going to do this shit anyway. Kids are going to grow up in the ways, if they are allowed to, they will grow up in the way that they are purposed to. Right. I'll come back to this. I was just thinking about a student that I'm going to talk about in a second. But the point here is that we should reimagine what safety looks like for all of our students and starting conversations, including with kids in kindergarten, about what makes them feel safe, what they imagine would allow their classmates, their peers, their community members, their friends to feel safe. to be brave and to demonstrate the kind of courage required to ask questions and demonstrate what you know and are trying to learn, and not centering what often become superficial conversation stoppers to avoid making people safe and doing the tough work required to sustain safety. That's um, that's one. The second is this also came from my dissertation. I explained sort of the genesis of it. I really wanted to also trouble the fact that data is often used by educators as a tool to affirm white supremacy. Like, if we don't have the data, we can't do that. That's
Mm,
by design, right? The five largest national data sets affecting education don't ask kids questions that contemplate them having whole identities.
mm,
When we acknowledge them as having a sexual orientation, gender identity, or the implications of expression, they're often relegated to behavioral studies, right? Like literal behavioral risk
yeah.
surveys. And then those don't contemplate that, like, those kids show up in environments, including schools. And so I wanted to trouble that. I used data that I got access to because of my privilege from GLSEN, their school climate survey, and then collected my own data. And one of the most important things that I learned using this mixed methods approach, right? Like using quantitative data, often white people's hard data, and qualitative data, which provides much more space for the kinds of nuances and pedagogies and theories like intersectionality and critical theory, which manifest in critical race theory, so we can think about things in more meaningful and vibrant ways. One of the things that the data showed was that respect matters a lot for students, for Black queer students, but it especially matters for Black trans students. The title in the slide and then the book chapter to be Aretha was right, which is to say that um, in an environment where we are now privileging the fragile feelings of white kids and enablers of white supremacy, we are missing that children are incredibly adept at asking questions about the things that they observe around them. One of the things that I miss most about teaching kindergarten, being enrolled in the process of helping them figure out the world that they didn't ask to be born into. And in the same way that, like, kids naturally will laugh a teacher who purports that Christopher Columbus discovered anything, let alone America, out of the room, to deny to children who at present the CDC said the vast majority of public school students, more than at any other point, identifies anything other than strictly heterosexual. 1 in 4 public school students
Yep.
are identifying as LGBTQIA. Most of them, the Q, heavy emphasis on we got questions.
Yep.
Um, this is really about us respecting students and their ability to peep game. And
Mm,
make sense of the fact that, so what I want to underscore for folks who are like afraid of the heterosexual agenda crumbling is that, like, this to me is as a researcher isn't an indication that kids are having more queer sex, but they are clear that, like, the boxes that we want them to check just don't really work for them.
mm,
It's the same reason why more of them are insisting on using pronouns as a way to check assumptions,
yep.
and using new terms to name themselves in the ways that Toni Morrison described have a whole lot of power. So thinking about respect and centering respect for students who are most marginalized, minoritized, neglected, and ignored is my second offering. The third is shorter, and educators have much technically less control over this, but it's to the point of gender neutral bathrooms. When my mother was struggling with this, when we produced a summit for African American LGBTQIA plus students, because I wanted to trouble these assumptions. And my mother had a difficult time with it. And I met a brilliant family. Elle was a first grader at the time, first or third, I thought third, second grader. And Elle's trans. And what I know, coloring Sonic the Hedgehog on the floor with L is that you can't tell me that L's not L, with all of the certainty of how they show up in the world. L's family produced a children's book that helps to animate, I hope, parts of this conversation is titled Calvin. Um, it's about a kid who knew what it was like to be them, because kids, like most
Mhm.
of us, are experts in our own lived experience. But my mother was having a challenging time about my excitement of having met and learning from Elle and their family. They have a brother named Ronnie. Dad's name is JR. Mom's name is Vanessa. I highlighted for my mother that she was parroting fears that were based on misinformation,
Mm.
right? Um, Acts against violence committed against children are more likely to be perpetrated by white, cisgendered, heterosexual men who often will abuse boys because boys are less surveilled.
Wow. Mm.
It is less likely the case that um, uh, uh, that's one part of it. Very much also connected to violence. We know that violence, sexual and intimate, is most likely to be perpetrated by somebody with familiar connections, somebody that somebody knows. So this idea that like um, my niece Jordan, her granddaughter, was going to be at a bathroom in Target, and a random trans person who needs to use the bathroom is going to commit an act of violence against her is as far fetched as Santa Claus.
Yep.
So let's frame that. Let's take this down a notch. So, and also the concerns around the bathroom, like, would be addressed if all bathrooms were gender neutral. Not only would that address some of these anxieties around the conflation of and really ignorance around gender and sex, and how biology and social construction mixed into all of that to paint pictures in people's minds. It would also address a need that lactating mothers have,
Mm.
are parents of young children, are people with pets. Like I said to her, your bathroom at home is a trans bathroom. And I struggle by naming like that. That's the one that the educators have the least control over, because I celebrate like on the Renaissance tour, all of the bathrooms are gender neutral,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right? Like, you
Sorry,
know,
Beyonce back there behind you.
I'm right, right next to Better Black. The good news about being Black American by Ebony Williams, Ebony K. Williams, right? So all of this to say that like there are ways that I would underscore one thing that's really important for me, especially in this moment, but as a legacy of the kind of teaching that is important to me, which is the Carter G. Woodson, like fugitive pedagogy, Bettina Love. This is about resistance and getting free. Like teaching is resistance.
Mm.
Um,
Yes.
we don't have to do the shit that they say that we should do. Um, I think about this a lot with regard to the visceral response that a lot of media librarians or media specialists and librarians had to taking out all of the books because they didn't want to trip over intentionally vague pronouncements of possible policy offerings. Our babies need books. They need access to windows and mirrors. So I would encourage folks to resist and to hit up Glisten, and they have a Rainbow Library book project, and download those books are fine. The banned books are connect to folks who are publishing in ways that we know are important for folks who want to get free. This just isn't Black shit. This is the same shit that happened in Nazi Germany when they started to ban books, isolate folks who were teaching truth, speaking truth to power, and otherwise trying to exterminate people. So resist. I offer three. Um, the last thing I'll say is this, and I've talked about this twice, but it's around mental health. The suicide rates for Black youth have doubled over the last 2 decades, which fucks me up when I think about the fact that kids don't ask to be born.
Yeah.
I often think about in these moments Nigel Shelby, who this year would have been 18 in February, which is my birth month. But Nigel died by suicide in Huntsville, Alabama, because it's still unacceptable to be Black and gay in Huntsville as it is in too many other places across the country. Um, and the fact that like Black kids are dying and we're not really discussing it, and most of this data is pre-COVID, so I know this shit's worse now. And I know as a researcher that like any data about us is an underreported data point because of justifiable mistrust and language barriers at a minimum. Um, But the suicide rates for Black youth are increasing while they are decreasing for every other community of children based on race or ethnicity. We don't collect as much data celebrating intersectionality by design, part why I did the dissertation, but we do know that when it comes to Black kids who are or are assumed to be LGBTQIA+, the rates are even more abysmal. The Trevor Project published data this year saying that 1 in every 4 Black trans folks have contemplated suicide in the last year. Young people, students, contemplated suicide in the last year. Data also says that when our babies are abused in schools, it's highly likely that they're not going to tell adults because they know that they don't trust adults to act in ways that are going to make them safe. And sadly, it is now the case that um, things that might have been restricted to the schoolhouse also permeate communities, right? So, 2017, there was data that showed that the Trump effect included students and educators naming the palpable tension that you mentioned earlier connected to politics. And now that you have not only educators being openly hostile homophobes and practicing trans misogynoir, you've got folks like the Black Lieutenant Governor of North Carolina standing in the pulpit of a Black church calling queer kids trash without impunity.
Yeah.
And so I would ask, plead, beseech educators, especially those giving the gift of their time to consume this conversation, to have a good therapist, one that requires you to do work outside of your appointment, and who understands that, much like education, in order to be good, one has to be culturally competent in all of its meanings. And then thereafter to model healthy trauma resolution and navigation practices for babies who are least likely to have access to the kind of support needed to navigate being forced to go to schools with adults who they know don't give a damn about them
Mm.
or their dreams or the fact that they are literally dying.
Well, man, I can't thank you enough for having this conversation with me. Those three takeaways of one, first off, engaging students, I think is so critically important, and engaging students in all the decisions that we make about them. So they should be at the table. But, to ensure, as educators that we are, you know, creating environments that are of love, and that we're reimagining safety and respecting students, and at the end of the day resisting. I think that many of our schools are in existence because they are founded by folks that want to resist some of the horrible things that are going on. But also, as I hope that there are teachers within these schools, all of our schools, that are learning and hearing from this conversation about the importance of creating environments in which kids are able to really be thinkers, and really to protect and grow and expand our democracy. And ultimately, that everybody, all of us, need a good therapist. I think that's one great thing that has happened in society over the most recent years, is that, even within our community, where it for so long was taboo, that we recognize the importance of therapy. So I appreciate you calling that out. But just ultimately, I just thank you for having this conversation with me. Then, wanting to connect with you forever. And, I would also encourage folks to follow you on social media. Can you just share what that is? Because they will learn something every darn day from you. Like, share your social media, please.
My
Yeah.
goal is to move people in some way. So
Yes.
be warned. I'm either Mr. David Johns or Dr. David Johns across platforms. Let me say thank you to you. I'll end where I begin in that regard as well. I've enjoyed this discussion. The one thing I'll leave sort of with folks who are asking the question of like why they should resist, is if you're not going to resist, then why are you there? I mentioned earlier, as I paused and processed, a student last year, June 2022, after completing my dissertation and defense and everything, I'm in Arthur Ashe Stadium in New York City where they hold the commencement activities, looking for the suite where Venus and Serena practice their crip walk after they win. And I heard someone call me Mr. Johns.
Mm.
And any educator knows when one of your babies, no matter how
Yes.
long it's been or how old they are, when they call you, you know it's one of your babies. And I stopped and processed hearing a voice that was familiar with a body that I hadn't experienced
Mm.
before. And the short of it is that I was introduced to Ernie, who
Mm.
I had the pleasure of teaching when they were Ernestine.
Mm.
And often I find that educators, much like adults, want physical reminders are things to hold them accountable for doing that which they know they should do. It pisses me off when men don't understand the importance of feminism and Black feminism until they have daughters,
Mm.
in spite of their other relationships to women. Um, it frustrates me that too many of us don't appreciate, especially Black folks, that most of us are born with or made to have a disability. And if we age, we'll grow into one. So we need to hold space for folks who have disabilities, especially those that are invisible or hidden. In the same way that I don't know why you need to know um, a queer person in order to believe that people shouldn't be discriminated against
Mm.
or not have access to the same privileges that other people um, would kill for, most not die for, but would at least kill for in our country. Um, and sometimes that's nice, but I would offer that most of the time we don't have moments with our babies who remind us about the importance of resisting if it means showing up for the possibility of.
Mm.
So I don't want people to be looking for queer kids or waiting for someone who is trans or uses progressive pronouns to understand why this work matters.
Mm.
It should be centered in every way, shape, and form.
Yes. Well, for all the Ernies and Ernestines and the Quintins and everybody in between, seriously, thank you so much for this conversation. For the Rashans in this country, like seriously, thank you so much for this conversation.
Yeah, my pleasure. Hope people consider us a resource.
Yes, thank you.